Ad hominems can come in a variety of forms. The most blatant forms involve personal attacks. These are the abusive ad hominems. But some forms are more subtle. A very common form of ad hominem fallacy involves guilt by association. I was inspired to do a tutorial on this after the recent 2008 federal elections here in the US. Criticism of candidates based on their associations has always been a part of politics. But the number and frequency of guilt by association arguments that we heard in this campaign was notable, in my experience at least. We saw it most often with criticisms of Barack Obama from various conservative circles, where it was argued that Obama had many radical associations, and that these indicated that he himself was much more socially and politically radical than he was letting on. This has the structure of a guilt by association argument. X believes A, X has an association with Y, and you conclude that Y probably also believes A. Not everyone classifies guilt by association as an ad hominem argument, but it's easy to see how the main ideas can be used to generate an ad hominem type argument. This is one way of phrasing the reasoning. Obama says X, but he's associated with people who seem to deny X, or say other things, Y, that seem to contradict X. So we conclude that Obama probably doesn't believe X, or is more sympathetic to Y than he lets on. The conclusion of an argument like this usually isn't very specific, but its primary use is to ground a charge of hypocrisy or misrepresentation, and this is generally how it was used against Obama. I don't want to suggest, by the way, that only Republicans are guilty of this sort of reasoning. One of Obama's main political tactics was to stress John McCain's associations with President Bush and the policies of his administration. But one could argue that guilt by association was a much more prominent feature of the campaign against Obama than it was in the campaign against McCain. Certainly there was more media discussion of the use of this argument form against Obama than there was of its use against McCain. Now, back to our main concern, is this a fallacy? Looking at the argument above, it's clear that, as stated, the argument is bad. And it's bad because the logic is weak. The conclusion simply doesn't follow from those premises. Why doesn't it follow? Well, two reasons. First, it's missing a premise that connects being associated with someone who believes Y with the conclusion that you probably believe Y too. So you'd have to add a premise to that effect to fix the logic. Second, the term associated with is too vague to be informative. Any defensible version of this argument would have to get very specific about the kind of association that is at issue. And the added premise to fix the logic would have to say something specific about how that particular association gives reason to believe that a person is lying about their stated beliefs. Now, in principle, this is doable. Certain kinds of associations may give good reason to question someone's honesty. But very often, these details aren't given, and the argument relies on vague and general claims like the one above. Under these conditions, the argument is bad and guilty of the ad hominem fallacy of guilt by association. But I said that in principle one could make an argument like this work if you were more specific about the kind of association you have in mind, and how that association supports the conclusion. Now, the problem with this strategy is that the additional premises needed to make the logic work tend to rely on generalizations that aren't very plausible, or claims of a specific nature for which there just isn't good evidence. To make the point, let's look at some examples. In the case of Bill Ayers, one of the ways that the guilt by association argument is played out looks like this. The Weather Underground was a radical protest group that Ayers co-founded in the 60s, and in the 60s and 70s they were responsible for some bombings of government buildings as part of their protest against the Vietnam War. Ayers is now a professor of education at the University of Chicago, and for many years he's been active in education reform and the fight against poverty in the Chicago area. He and Obama met in Chicago in the mid-1990s while Obama was working as a community organizer. They've served on a couple of boards together, and by both of their admissions, have generally had friendly, though not particularly close, relations over the years. Now, if the conclusion we're after is that in virtue of this association with Ayers, we have good reason to think that Obama actually condones the bombings of those government buildings carried out by the Weather Underground, then it's obvious that the logic is still weak. To fix it, you need a premise like this. Anyone who has friendly relations with a person of the sort described in premise 2 probably condones the actions of that person. This would fix the logic and make the argument strong. However, this premise as a generalization is wildly implausible. We can all think of examples of friends and acquaintances we have who've done bad things in the past that we judge to be wrong, but nevertheless remain friends or acquaintances with them. The same applies for political affiliations. Having friendly relations with people who lean strongly to the left doesn't by itself give good reason to think that you lean strongly to the left. This is what I mean when I say that guilt by association arguments often rely on generalizations about people that are implausible. Now, maybe Obama is more sympathetic to radical views than he lets on. My point is that this kind of argument doesn't give us good reason to think so. For the sake of contrast, an argument that would give us good reason might look like this. If we knew, maybe because we had tape-recorded evidence, that Obama had private meetings with Ayers, where he admits that he condones the activities of the Weather Underground, but acknowledges that he can't say this in public without destroying his political career, then of course we'd have good reason to accept the conclusion. If the premises were true, this would be a good argument. But this is the problem. We don't have any evidence that this new premise is true. Also, note that when your association is very specific like this and contains information that directly supports the conclusion, then you're not really dealing with the guilt by association argument anymore. Since the mere association with Ayers isn't what's driving the inference, it's the tape-recorded evidence of Obama's own words that is driving the inference. I think this is a common pattern with guilt by association arguments. If the argument is running solely on the association, then it's generally a bad argument. But if the association is specific enough and contains information that directly supports the conclusion, then it's really not a guilt by association argument anymore. It's an argument based on more tangible and relevant forms of evidence. The upshot is that guilt by association is a fallacy when the argument relies entirely on the association to drive the conclusion. But if it relies on other kinds of information, then it's not a guilt by association argument anymore.